Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for joining me. It is great to have everyone here today on Zombie Day. Oops, I forgot my banner. There we go. We cannot forget to say thank you to the patrons. And with me today is Fallacy Dave Worley. Hello, Dave.
Hello. Good to be back. Thank you.
Yeah. And we are here for two purposes. One is to laugh at how silly it is that today, Good Friday, is Zombie Day, the day that allegedly, according to the Gospel of Matthew, the dead saints got up and walked through Jerusalem. And they were seen by many, and yet no one seemed to notice them except whoever wrote the Gospel of Matthew, who probably wasn't even there. And actually, we could use that to come into our first fallacy, Dave. What kind of a fallacy or bias would that be a tendency to show that someone related this event that somehow nobody else noticed?
My initial thoughts would go towards the anecdotal fallacy. So it's the idea that somebody's told a story and you don't really know how reliable the source could be. Now, what's really important with trying to provide sources to these sorts of things is that they are reliable. Otherwise, anybody can make up anything and we'll just end up believing anything. So there's a wonderful phrase within it actually comes from cryptocurrency circles, which is don't trust, verify, meaning you don't have to trust the person next to you's word. You can verify a particular transaction on the blockchain. And I don't need to get into that sort of conversation yet. That's a very heavy conversation to be having, but you get the idea. It's the idea that we can independently verify for ourselves what is true.
Yeah, that is something that I use all the time as a kaja. I am used to people lying to me, people exaggerating, and people wanting to appear to look better than they really are. And so the most common thing that comes up as a kaja, and if you don't know what a kaja is a court-appointed juvenile advocate. And what I'm doing is I'm usually working with children who are in the foster care system, and the parents are trying to work through a program so that they can get their children back. And so the parents are telling, I did this, I did this, I did this. And the response is always the same. Great. I'm so glad you accomplished that. Now show me some documentation. Like they'll say, okay, I finished my parenting classes. Wonderful. I'm so glad to hear it. Let me see the certificate. Yeah. And we do that all the time. Oh, I left it in the car. I'll get it later, and you never see it.
Yeah, that's a shame. I think some people see the actual objective, like trying to change, and then there's other people that see how to actually achieve it. So you could thinking just ad-libbing here off the top of my head, if you were to try and rob a bank, let's say if you watch Sherlock, the more recent one with Benedict Cumberbatch and I forget who plays Moriarty, but he's that Irish guy. And basically there's this sort of big thing about there's these 6 lines of code that that Moriarty's tapped in Morse code, and it's secretly left it in Sherlock's brain subconsciously, and this is why all these people want Sherlock alive, was because they want this code, whereas actually it's not. It's just he bribed a bodyguard, so he was just playing this trick. And that's exactly the point. At any point that we provide a certificate like that, well, how do we know it wasn't faked? We have we have diploma mills, which certain people, not naming names, Kent Hovind, try and obtain a doctorate from. And there was a wonderful documentary piece. I've forgotten who made it, but it's just only come out in the past few days or weeks or something like that. If you type in sort of newer videos to do with Kent Hovind, there's this wonderful hour and a half that just goes into the background of all of his antics.
And I'm going to bring up my first zombie, since I said I was going to have some zombies here today. This is an artistic picturing, a rendering of what it must have looked like in Jerusalem if the dead had gotten up and were rising around and walking around.
Marvelous.
I
also into the live chat.
Okay. I also brought a few zombie fun facts. And some interesting zombies include zombie has been derived from the African word nzambi, which means God. So evidently zombies used to be gods at one time. Zombies represent all that is dark and base about the human condition. The fear of zombies often stems from real human fears regarding unfamiliar or chaotic forces in the world. And that draws us right back to biases. Some biases result from fears. Do you want to talk about that a little bit, Dave?
Sure. So if it can work both ways, of course. So if you have a particular fear, it might be, let's say, off the top of my head,
you could go with your spotlight effect. You know, your fear of everyone looking at you, like the spotlight effect that you talk about in the book.
Okay, so the spotlight effect is the idea that everyone's looking at you. Everyone can focus on the thing that you're focusing on as much and as intensely as you are. It's the idea that everyone's got their eyes in the back of your head, staring at the back of your head, and worded that correctly. But it's that when we focus on a particular thing, it's at the forefront of our mind, and therefore we are skewed in our decision making as a result. Usually this is particularly when it comes to the spotlight effect, it makes you feel like you're the one on the stage with the spotlight on you and everyone's looking at you. A very similar sort of bias is the available heuristic, whereby something very recently happened and therefore that skews your particular perspective. The example I give in the book is something along the lines of binge watching Shark Week for the whole week, let's say, and then on the Sunday you go to the beach and now you're terrified to get into the sea. Right? You weren't going to be terrified a week ago, but now you are. And then in a year's time, you've forgotten about Shark Week and you go in the ocean anyway. So, yeah.
And that makes me realize that, I don't think I ever really fully introduced the books that you have. Dave has written a book called Fantastic Fallacies and Where to Find Them. And Dave has another book, a second book that has come out that is a companion to that, which is Fantastic Fallacies and Brilliant Biases. And in the second book, you focus more on biases and less on fallacies. Is that correct?
Yeah, just only a smidgen. I mean, these books do overlap, so they won't be, 50 fallacies in the first book, 50 biases in the second. I do drip feed sort of ideas that then link into the future third film, as it were.
Okay.
Which I've already started my thought processes on. Which would be also a very interesting sort of direction to go in, maybe a bit later in the conversation. So when I'm formulating the books Fantastic Fallacies and Where to Find Them, or Fantastic Fallacies and Brilliant Biases, I've focused on one overarching theme. The first book, the yellow book, Where to Find Them, is all about looking at other people and trying to find their flaws, which is relatively easy to do because it's meant to be a beginner book. The second book, Brilliant Biases, is trickier, not just because of the topics being discussed, but also because you're now looking at yourself and you're having to look at, the way you think, and it's more difficult to try and criticize yourself than it is somebody else. So this has to be worded in a very specific way. And yeah, whether I've got it right or not, I don't know, but let me know, because obviously the first book, over the course of, it started as, I think it was May of the pandemic, so it's just the very first couple of months or two that book came out, and there was a big sort of rush towards that book, and I don't think many people are as aware of the second book. Looking at the numbers, although we did get a lot of promo from I didn't even expect Rationality Rules to sort of fling it around the page. You did it the other month as well. It's getting completely unprovoked. It's wonderful that people have sort of warmed to it and find it useful, apart from that one Amazon review. But go on.
Okay, very good. I'll have to give it one then. I hadn't thought about that, but yeah, I will have to do that. The one bias in there that I come across all the time is confirmation bias.
Yeah.
Because that is, being an anti-theist, one of the things we see in theism all the time is the bias towards seeing your own God in any idea of something supernatural. But we have our own bias in that respect as well. I'll let you address that.
Do you mean as atheists? And
yes.
Mm-hmm. And that sort of thing? Oh, interesting. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So this is a main theme of the second book, is that, and it came out of that one bad review as well, because the first book was very warmly received, apart from one guy who said it's so biased towards Christians and that sort of thing. It's like, it's just indoctrinating me, and it's like, okay, fair enough. I'm just gonna slate my own team as well then. So that's what I did. And so there are multiple different ways in which people try and find kinship and solidarity, and that's not a bad thing. It's just a pattern seeking thing that we have evolved to do, and it has a particular purpose within social groups, this sort of in-group out-group mentality. Unfortunately, I seem to be under the impression, whether I'd be right or wrong, that atheists are now doing the same thing, and they're coming to what may be hasty generalizations about people and their character. They're going after the person rather than the idea quite often. They're trying to exclude certain people from even having the conversation, and that's a very that deserves far more than the amount of books that I've written in terms of trying to discuss.
Yeah, because that is a really sticky issue. I'm not going to name any names, but there's a certain person who was recently essentially banned from the atheist community. And when the information first started coming out about this person, I was saying, now, wait a minute, if this person has already done their time and, because this person was convicted of a crime, and they've paid their debt to society, don't we owe it to them to move on? But then when all of the facts came out and it was supported by documentation that was essentially irrefutable, that the crimes that this person committed were horrendous crimes. And in addition to the horrendous crimes, this person had been lying to the community about their credentials, and he just lost all credibility and has now been banished from the community. And that's an extreme example. But what about the person who maybe makes a terrible mistake? Really steps in it and puts their foot in their mouth. Do we forgive them and move on, or do we cancel them? That becomes a much more difficult issue.
Yeah, I'm just making a note of that so we can talk about the specifics of that after we end the stream. So I was just catching up with something earlier today that was along those lines, and yeah, it is very shocking if I'm not getting my wires crossed. But well, yeah, specifics aside, we do seem to have various different biases, and I discuss this in the book. So there's groupthink and in-group bias as well. So in terms of groupthink, it's more like if you were new to these sorts of spaces, you might have been love bombed, as it were, where everyone just loves you straight away, and then that sort of dies away after time. As I've experienced, I don't know about you, but that seems to have happened.
I have too, absolutely.
Yeah. So what happens there is you have a tendency to be warm towards those people because you've probably, if you're an apostate and you've left a religion, you're probably being shunned by someone else. And so in order for the love bomb to just suddenly come in, it's like, oh, I'm welcome, I'm here, I found my place, kind of thing. And as such, you have a tendency, one has a tendency to side with that group and will never challenge them, and then you just go along for a while with various ideas, even though it feels intuitively, like gut feeling, some things are wrong and maybe I shouldn't be doing it, but it makes me feel better than the last group I was in, so I'm just going to roll with it. That's groupthink. Whereas in-group bias is more like looking at that in-group and looking out towards an out-group and siding with the group that you're in against some other tribe, regardless. And remember, these a lot of these biases, the common theme is separating the person with the idea. This is all to do with people. They are part of my tribe, therefore I'm siding with these people, and that's not rational. We need to look at the idea and say it doesn't matter where the idea came from, it's a good idea if it's just a good idea. This is why it's so difficult with certain very specific ideas. I can go around any group of people or any individual and I can say I agree with you here and I disagree with you here. So when you bring up a particular name, like, I don't know, controversial figure like Jordan Peterson or Ben Shapiro, there might be some very specific sentences I agree with, bearing in mind they're sentences and I disagree with the rest of the paragraph, right? But it becomes very difficult because of an in-group bias to say, actually, I think that's a very good idea. Like that one sentence, I disagree with sort of Peterson on God or something like that, but that one specific piece of psychology, actually, he is an expert and that is his sort of doctorate and he does know what he's talking about. And it's very difficult to say that in front of your group because there might be consequences if you do that and you get stigmatized. And that's what happens with many a religion when they're not kept in check and they shun people who disagree with them and that sort of thing.
I have a request in the chat for the zombies.
Oh, hello, B.
There you go, B. This is another artist rendition of the zombies from Matthew chapter 25.
That's wonderful. It's a little bit small, but it's you can still see it.
Yeah, I don't know how to make it do the full screen.
Try zoom. So we've got the bar at the top, the third one on the left.
Well, if I do that, that just does that, and that's not any better.
So you've got along that bar, that third one. Is that better?
There we go.
Might be.
There we go. Yeah, that's much better.
Hey.
Okay. Hey, I learned 2 things today. This morning I was on Heretical. No, it was a couple days ago on my own show. I learned how to move people around. I didn't realize that I could do this and cause us to switch places. I learned that on Wednesday night.
Whoa.
I actually have a third zombie picture, and this one I think is probably the most amazing of all. And I'm going to zoom in on this one a little bit before I bring it up, because I think this one is kind of a more modern rendition. There we go. I don't think that's what they were wearing back in Bible days, but that is an interesting image to think about of what the zombies may have looked like.
I have to say I much prefer the Shaun of the Dead rendition than others, because they at least they're slow moving. I was watching, those little clips that come out now and again on TV shows. They'll just throw them out on YouTube sometimes. QI does it. Don't know if viewers are aware of QI. So it was presented by Stephen Fry and then by Sandy Toxic. Now it's basically just this show on sort of intellect. It's one of those sorts of things that maybe there aren't as many shows like that in America. There's Jeopardy and there's things like that, but there was a clip with Stephen Fry asking, how long would it take if you were a zombie and you bit me and then I bit B, etc. How long would it take for the entire world to turn zombie? Would you care to take a guess?
Let's see. Each zombie bites how many people?
It's whatever is the same rate. This is going to be something like, obviously not slow enough to get away from me, kind of thing.
Okay. 50 years?
Anybody in the live chat? It's less than 50 years.
Okay. We'll see.
This is a mathematical question.
Okay.
But remind me, otherwise I'll forget.
Okay, I'll try to do that.
Give them 5 minutes. Yeah.
One of the things that you brought in the book, and I'm going to bring up the bias, made me think of a story where this had happened to me.
Just having a look at it.
Okay.
Go for it. No, I'm going to read along.
Okay. I was going to bring up the crowd effect. Do you want to hear my story with crowd effect, or do you want to? Well, I'll let you explain the bias first.
Is it the bystander effect?
Yes.
But yeah, definitely. So I don't need to look in the book for that. Occasionally I do actually have to look in the book for my own things. I do sometimes forget. Even the best scientists in the world don't remember every single piece of thing that they've written down. So the bystander effect is when we're in a large group, we have a tendency to expect somebody else to do something. So for example, if somebody needs first aid and you're the only one there, or you're like one of 2-3 people there, you're more likely to jump in and help because you feel personally responsible, rather than being in a group of 30 people and you say, somebody else would deal with it, right? It's obviously a dangerous idea because everyone's thinking that. And, if you mess up that first aid and you're in they for whatever reason end up in a court case or something like that, there's lots of witnesses. So you're just like, it's too much hassle. Let somebody else do it.
Well, my personal experience with this was I was driving one of my kids to school, and there had been a snowstorm that evening, and the road was particularly slick, and a vehicle had slid and gone partially off the road and was stuck, but the back end of her car was blocking the road so nobody else could get through, and the traffic was all piling up. And there were 2 cars between me and the car that was stuck, and nobody was doing anything. We were all just sitting there. And I thought, she doesn't look like she's that far off the road. I bet just a bit of a push would get her out. And well, nobody else is doing anything. So I stopped my car and I got out and I started trying to push her car. Now, if you've never seen all of me, I am a very small person. I am all of 5'1". And at the time, I'm heavier than that now, but at the time I was only about 130 pounds. So me trying to push this car in the snow had absolutely no effect whatsoever, except that when I got out and started pushing the car, the guy who was in the car right behind her got out of his car shortly afterward and started helping. He was twice my
Mm.
size. In 2 minutes, we had her pushed out of there. Now, I could never have done that by myself. And what was even funnier is I knew the guy. He even went to my church. But I thought, really, dude, you just sat there until I got out and showed you, hey, we could push this car out.
Yeah, this is it's a wonderful thing, because when I do these interviews, the people remind me of things, and that does link into one of the many things I want to talk about in the third book, which is obviously unreleased, unwritten, and is currently fully conceptual. So this might not even make the actual book, but I want to talk about leadership, and I want to talk about how to change people's ideas, and now trying to actually make some sort of active movement towards improving the situation. And so I'm sure there's many criticisms out there of various different speakers. So if I say a particular name, please don't sort of throw me under the bus, but there was a very famous TED talk by somebody called Simon Sinek, who says basically you've got to try and find your why. It's not about me. Say, for example, if I'm trying to sell the book, I don't just say, I've got a book, give me money. I say, if you want to live in a more sane, rational world where critical thinking is taught in schools, this book can help any beginner try to understand these fallacies and teach them to others. So I start by saying my why. The reason I'm writing the book, right? It's not about the end goal of selling 1 million trillion books. It's all about just helping that one person who really is looking for that help. And another thing he says is on leadership, and that leadership is not a position of authority. It's not about obeying somebody who's in charge. It's about leading others and having the moral caliber and the spine to be able to actually do what you've done and say, this is the right thing to do, follow me. And it's leading from the front. It's being the last person off the ship while it's sinking. It's that sort of idea. And it's fascinating to talk to, and it'd probably be really interesting to talk to B about that idea, because they're an ex-veteran, or a veteran, once a veteran, always a veteran. That B's probably got quite a lot of good stories about camaraderie, and knowing that, it's not necessarily the biggest and the strongest person that makes it into the army or navy or wherever. It's somebody who's got the right mentality. And so yeah, I commend your mentality in that scenario.
Well, thank you. I don't think of myself as a leader. In fact, I think myself just the opposite, because I have found that whenever I'm asked to lead a group, that is the death knell of the group. Within about 6 months, the group will be disbanded.
Well, I suppose it depends on the group and how, how much were those individuals truly dedicated towards your why, why you were doing whatever it was you were doing. And obviously we're still here. I'm still here after a few years, and we're still trying to make the world a more sane and rational place.
Definitely.
To varying degrees of success, I might say, but we're doing a little bit. Well, people feel like unassailable goals are too big, and really it's just, you're not trying to jump up the stairs all in one jump. You go up little steps, and it's those little steps. You can do one step at a time, and it can take time, but you'll eventually get there, especially if you lead others.
Eric Mishima says, I feel better about myself already. We have
Well,
succeeded.
I can change that. Wonderful to hear from you. Haven't heard from you before, so I should say that I am very sarcastic sometimes. Theo, hello to Theo as well. I don't know about if you know the story. Me and Theo were both on Truth Wanted, the ACA production. So that was the first time I was on, and me and Dan were presenting, and Theo called in, and they I can't remember the exact conversation. It was something to do with some sort of objective morality. I can't quite remember, but we were just very polite, and now Theo's just following me around everywhere. So yeah, may
Theo,
that continue.
I see Theo in my chat frequently.
Yeah, good guy.
Mm-hmm. And Theo says downstairs you can take all in one jump, but it's not recommended.
This is also another thing which I think I mentioned. I do briefly mention this in the prologues. One of the few non-controversial things I put in the prologue to the second book, which is I quote Helen Pluckrose in Cynical Theories, who says equal access to rubble is not a worthy goal. And that basically means that it's easy to tear people down, but it's very difficult to try and build things, to create things. I think that's definitely a direction I want to go in with the third book, because it takes so long to build. It's particularly when we talk about reputations. It takes so long to build and so little time to destroy. And that sort of idea is very interesting. I don't see too many people building. There are, obviously, because we are right now, but there are too many people that are willing to tear down. There's various pieces of psychology behind that.
Okay. Heading back to the zombies for just a minute with Steel Rain's comment. World War Z, it took place in Jerusalem in the movie, and then supposedly, according to the Gospel of Matthew, it happened back then also. And he says, I'm not much into zombie movies, but I do like Train to Busan.
Yeah.
I'm actually not into zombie movies at all either. I personally don't care for zombies. But when it comes to the theory that there were supposedly all these zombies walking around in Jerusalem, I just find that so hilarious. And I also find it I also find it interesting that, this would have to have been one of the biggest miracles of all time. And yet Christians kind of don't mention it, probably because it's kind of dumb. Most likely it didn't happen.
It is a little silly. I should before I forget, the question, how many days would it take? It's actually only 38 days apparently for the entire world to go zombie. So if you're of the particular persuasion where you need to get some cargo containers and corner yourself off in a deserted part of America, then now is the better time than any to avoid the apocalypse. But those people are fascinating, though. I think there's a degree to which, I mean, they're conspiracy theorists. You know who I'm talking about, the people who sort of ration their food away into the hoarders, like the sort of doomsday hoarders. That's what they are.
Right.
I mean,
people who have the underground, like the storm cellars, and they've got them all stocked, and yeah.
They'll outlive all of us.
We were talking about that on my stream a little bit the other day, that I mentioned that when I was a believer, if I came home and nobody was home, I used to get scared thinking, oh no, the rapture came and I got left behind. Yeah.
Well, I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. I'm not sure. I take the Stephen Fry line on heaven. I'm not sure I would want to get in. Certainly not on his terms anyway. Yeah.
Yep. So, Dave, what do you think is the greatest bias that is impacting our society today?
So, one of the things that the second book is trying to touch upon is the very nature of our conversations that has happened, what feels like 2015 onwards, where as particularly in the UK, we're in a very uncomfortable coalition between the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats at one point, and then in 2015, everything starts to hit the fan. Brexit in 2016, then there's Trump, all the way up to and including the war in Ukraine, which I'm very pleased it's going relatively well for Ukraine, and I sincerely hope that the rumors are true and they have taken down the flagship battleship from the Moskva or whatever it's called, because that's hilarious. Especially the way in which they apparently did it. They distracted them, and there's only 180-degree coverage of one of their radars. They pointed it in the other direction. The missiles came in the other direction. So, sorry, what are we talking about? Biggest bias. So, what's happened is our conversations have become unhealthy for various different reasons. And I could point to various different fallacies or biases. I think I initially will mention the Mott and Bailey, because I think it's important that people know it, and I've deliberately mentioned it as the first fallacy in the second book. The first is always very important. The first book, it was Straw Man, and now this is Mott and Bailey. So Mott and Bailey, for those who don't know, is the idea that there was a castle design. There's lots of different castle designs. One of them was a Mott and Bailey. Bailey is a very open, large area at the bottom of the hill, and that was very easy to attack. Once that got attacked, people would retreat up the hill to a much smaller motte, and that motte is very easy to defend. It's literally got the high ground. So in terms of argumentation, you have a Bailey, which is very difficult to defend, and once it gets attacked, once I attack that idea, the person will retreat to a motte, which is a very easy to agree with, very easy to defend argument. I've already mentioned rationality rules. He pointed this out brilliantly when he was debating Stefan Molyneux, or around about that time anyway. And he says, I can make a blanket statement that says something along the lines of men are better than women, right? Doesn't sound too far away from what Stefan Molyneux would say. So, you know, not something I agree with, but let's say that argument was put forward. Obviously, a very controversial opinion. And then when you go to challenge me on such a view, I then retreat and I say, well, are you denying that there are differences between men and women? Right. So obviously there are some differences. That's very easy to agree with, but it doesn't follow on that is a good reason for coming to the conclusion that men are better than women. I could flip that on its head and say there are differences, therefore women are better than men, right? So I don't think it's necessarily the biggest bias, because I think that's probably hasty generalization and people coming to conclusions too quickly. But I think it's the most important one that people need to look out for, because people will put forward a controversial view, and when it gets challenged, it's more used as like a distraction, really. It's not quite a red herring, but it is a means of simplifying their argument into agreeable terms. And that sort of it deflects people away from them. So what actually happens in terms of conversations is lots of new people come into the conversation and they keep being deflected away. Right. So if you actually stick with the conversation, you notice the flaw that they're making, you actually go, okay, we can agree on that bit, but let's get back to the actual argument that I was challenging. Does that make sense? Hope so.
I'm trying to think of an example of that, and at first I was thinking of one person in particular, but then I realized no, he wasn't a good example of that at all. I was starting to think of Matt Walsh. Are you familiar with Matt Walsh?
It
He
rings a
does a lot of things
bell.
with Ben Shapiro.
Okay.
He's extremely transphobic, and he makes no he doesn't hide that at all. But he's almost the opposite of what you say, because he actually makes statements that are deliberately provocative to try to draw out his interlocutors, and then have the conversation at that point. But he does not look for anything whatsoever to try to find in common with them. And that's why I realized that, no, that was not a good example of what you were talking about at all.
Yeah, that's fine. The what you do bring up is a very common theme that I've stuck with through both books. I'm sure it'd be the same going forwards. I first try to outline Daniel Dennett's reformulation of Rappaport's rules, and you say a very important thing there, which is one of those rules is to state where you agree. So the rules are there because if we want to try and criticize somebody's argument and we want them to sincerely try and change their mind, which is a very important part of the argument, then we have to fulfill 3 criteria. We don't misrepresent them. We have to represent them accurately. Secondly, as you say, we have to state where we agree. So we have sort of similarity of some sort of kinship, and then state what we don't know or what we've learned from the other person. And so it's also very important in sort of selling. You know, when you point out your why, as I said earlier, you have to state, hey, we have the same problem. Here's how I solved my problem, and this is how you could solve your problem too, right? That's how typically things are sold to us. And we're sent on this emotional roller coaster where we're reminded of the bad thing. And it's like, yes, you can give me that good feeling. So we're given that sort of tiny little sort of bit of cortisol or whatever it is, and we get a bit more stressed out by going, there's this problem, right? And then here's the solution. It's like, we get that rush of like dopamine or whatever it is. So yeah, I can't remember the question actually. Funny enough, I just went off on one there.
I had asked, the original question was, what do you think is the area that is the most problematic in today's culture? What area of bias do you think that most people exhibit that is the most problematic today?
Okay, so I think sort of tribalism is a very important one. I mean, it's worded differently because that could be broken down into lots of little things, like I've said, with in-group bias and that sort of thing. That also comes into guilt by association. I was going to say something because when you mentioned, is it Matt Walsh? Did you say Matt Walsh? You immediately mentioned Ben Shapiro, and then so people will think, I don't like that person, therefore I don't like this person either. Now you've obviously justified that by saying these are the ideas to disagree with Matt Walsh on, and then that's fine. But so one of the things I'm going to probably describe in the third book would be that there is the person's view. Let's just have concentric circles here. So so I have to remember my camera's there, and that's not quite in line with everything else that I've got on the table. So there's somebody's view, circle in the middle. Okay. Then there's the people that are around them in an inner circle, and then there's the people on the outside, on the outer circle. So somebody could post an opinion there, just saying my opinion is whatever it is, Matt Walsh's opinion, your opinion, doesn't matter. And then there's people around them that will interpret that opinion. It's not putting this in front of my face, right? So they will interpret that opinion. They will put that opinion through their filter, and the people on the outside will only see through that filter. So one statement of information could be true, could be not, can be interpreted here by Fox News, and be interpreted here by CNN, and be interpreted here by Dave, and be interpreted here by Kelly, right? And then our audience, our in-group, will have 4 completely different perspectives on the same thing. Now, this is what's happening in our conversations. Let's take a very contemporary example. Actually, the I shouldn't bring that up.
Actually, a perfect example is the war in Ukraine. We get a perspective on what's going on in Ukraine from the more liberal media, if that's what you're watching. And primarily what you see is the atrocities that the Russian troops are committing against the people of Ukraine. But if you go to the more conservative news sources, they will focus on something different. And one of the things that I have been really interested in, but I know I don't have access to, is I would really like to see what Russian people are seeing on the Russian news about what's going on in Ukraine, because they're getting just a completely different story.
Yeah, there's lots of interesting moments we can talk about there, because Anonymous were hacking the Kremlin at one point, and then there's this commentary to do with how Putin's got a complete monopoly on state media and like traditional media, but the social media he has no control over, and they're getting a completely different message, which is typically dominated by the young rather than the old, and the certain tactics that seem to be the case, and maybe my sources are biased, but it seems to be the case that what we've been seeing over the course of, might be Brexit or Trump or this, it doesn't really matter which side of the fence we're going on, in terms of the structure of saying one thing and doing another and then blaming the other side. There's something that I haven't put in any of the books yet called DARVO, if people have heard of that. That's deny and reverse victim offender. This was it's a wonderful skit in South Park where Randy's on the phone to Mr. Garrison, who is playing like Trump as president, and he's sat in the Oval Office with his feet up, and he's on the phone trying to explain Darvo to Randy, and Randy's just like, "You did X, whatever it was," and then Mr. Garrison turns around and says, "No, I didn't do that. You did that." Right? It's basically that. That's what Trump did for 4 years. And so that's also essentially what what Putin's doing. He's going out and saying, look at all these people that are lying in the streets. This is what the Ukrainian Nazis are doing. And it's like, they're getting the backing of Britain and the EU and America. Like, we all fought against Nazis, or at least I shouldn't say we, because I'm now sort of pretending I was around in 1945. So I missed it by like a half a century. I was there, okay, I was there. So, but obviously that maybe there's a bias in there somewhere, or a fallacy, where I'm taking responsibility for things which I wasn't actually there for, like a transitive property due to country or personal identity, something like that. There's definitely something in there. I'm gonna have to spend some more time thinking about that.
Okay.
Yeah.
We have a question for you.
Oh no.
Eric asks, did you have the luxury to add your humor to your books, or did they need a more serious tone?
You know what? That's very kind, Eric. I try to do more than anything is be relatable. So when you had a stream a few weeks ago with was it Dave and Ian? I think I can't quite remember. You it might be months ago actually.
That Dave and Joe. Dave and Joe.
Was it Joe? And yeah, they were talking about fallacies too. It's a wonderful conversation if people want to check that out after this stream. But the way in which that conversation was going, but I'm not saying it's wrong to do this, was talking about formal fallacies, informal fallacies, deductive reasoning, inductive reasoning, and that goes over people's heads. What I find is that it goes over my head, right? I know I understand it, but it's just sort of like it comes across in a bit as a bit grey. Does that make sense? Whereas if you describe, as I did with non sequitur, example of whether I would say it's humor or not, I don't know. It's just part of my country's charm, I suppose. But I explained the non sequitur fallacy in the following terms: fish can swim, Dave can swim, therefore Dave must be a fish. And this is an obvious flaw in reasoning, but I think people prefer those examples that are more relevant. And what I've tried to do is steer. I've mentioned the religious side of things, and I've gone back into like this is where the hypocrisy is in like a little specific bit of the Bible or the Quran, but I haven't touched upon that. I've touched upon more contemporary examples because I think it brings, not only does it bring in a wider audience, it simplifies things into more understandable language. One of the main criticisms, as we mentioned earlier, with Peterson is Jordan Peterson. He will use very complicated language to try and explain something, and I'm naturally restricting myself to 1 page per fallacy or 1 page per bias, and that means I've got about 8 sentences, about maybe 200 words, no, or maybe less than that, whereby I'm trying to convey what it is, how to notice it, who uses it, how to challenge it. Like that's 4 things, right? So I'm trying to condense it down and essentialize, and also I'm not going into as much detail as I could. So therefore, for various reasons, you do have to use either maybe it's humor or wit in some sort of way. What's very important to me is that I challenge everyone. I would like to think I am a proper skeptic. I am not somebody who is going to be swayed by my group, even though I almost definitely am. And the way to do that is to challenge every idea and take everything to its logical conclusion. So if I throw it out to Eric because I haven't seen Eric around before, and I wish them well. If you are not aware of my former podcast, you can search for David Worley, Worley, and you'll see these massive bright orange thumbnails, and there's 160 podcasts there with various different atheists, but also futurists and secularists, and those sorts of conversations where I'm talking to Alex O'Connor about veganism, or it might be sort of political in conversation. I try and find. So stop distracting me, Mark. I need gills to be a fish. So this is also a massive problem as well. This is a very big problem for me, which is why I write things down. I'm often finding myself in the middle of the night, I'm about to go to bed. You know that feeling when you've forgotten to brush your teeth? It's basically that, but for having an idea that I desperately need to write down. There's notes on my phone where it's just, some of it's good, some of it's bad, and you need to sleep on some of these ideas because some of them are silly. But I am definitely someone who gets up in the middle of the night and just like, I need to write down that idea because I get so easily distracted. Like what Mark just did. So but Mark knows that anyway. So
I used to be that way about poetry, and I would dream that I was writing a poem, and sometimes I would wake up in the middle of the night and think, "Oh, I've got to get up and write this down because if I go back to sleep in the morning, I won't remember the poem." But sometimes I have found that when I then start thinking about the poem that I came up with, I suddenly realized it didn't make any sense. When I was asleep, it made perfect sense and it was a brilliant poem. But when you're awake and lucid, you look at it and you go, that's just nonsense.
Maybe there's a market for that. Sleep poems, they're not meant to make sense. Like
Good
Kelly
point.
Pearsall, you know?
Okay, I've got a couple more zombie facts that I'm going to share. Zombie fans are called zombophiles, and
Ooh.
I thought this one was really good. There is a law in Haiti that it is a crime to turn someone into a zombie.
So
So
how would one do that? Just out of interest.
I have no idea. I just think that that's interesting that
How
someone thought
how
they
easy
needed
is
a
it?
law for that.
Can it be faked to the point where you can just get your enemy in prison, you know?
And B says, "Well, we do have similar DNA to birds, so."
Mm.
And Mark
There's
Caesar says, "They're dead, Dave. They're all dead."
I'll
Oh.
throw out you mentioned birds actually. One other idea. I'll succumb to Dunning-Kruger if I start saying I'm an expert in anything at all, actually. But one of these ideas that I'm trying to explore right now is this idea of our reptilian brain, the amygdala, the oldest part of our brain, and it's responsible for sleep, food, that sort of thing. Those primal sort of instinct things. So when we get scared or something, that's the part of the brain that kicks off. And I find it myself coming to the conclusion over the past week or so that people can't be rational, and because that's different, the newer part of our brain, people can't use that part of their brain if they're distracted by their amygdala. Basically, they're not
Mm,
fulfilling something. That if you're
mhm.
worrying about your next meal, you're not able to be rational.
Okay.
So I find myself coming to the conclusion that if we truly want people to be more rational, then we should put more of our time towards increasing the pool of people that are out of poverty. Does that make sense? So there's
Mhm.
that
Mhm.
natural, it's a
Mhm.
biological reason for us to try, and if we want to be more rational, if we want a more critical thinking world, it makes sense for us to try and get people out of that situation. The opposite is obviously the idea that if people are suffering in that sort of way, they are ripe for religion because they pick on the
Mm.
poorest, they pick on those that are vulnerable, they're not fulfilling that amygdala. And as soon as you do, you then have the space psychologically to be able to think. At least that's where my thoughts are going right now. Feel free
Mhm.
to tell me I'm wrong.
No, I think you're spot on. I think you're spot on because, thinking of my own personal experience, it was when I was encountering insurmountable difficulties that I was drawn into religion. And
Mm.
it was through ration and reason that I was drawn out. But it took decades in between before I ever was able to get to that point because my mind was just too closed off to it.
Yeah, it's a fair point. And the only thing I'd also add to that is there's a lot of people running around, particularly on social media, that seem to think they jump to the hasty generalization that says we can't possibly change those people's minds, and we can
We
because
can.
their minds were changed. Right?
Mhm.
It's very odd that those people would turn around and go, "Oh, other people can't change their minds." Obviously, they change their mind, and the way to do that, I've seen from all those podcasts and everyone I've ever talked to about apostasy or whatever it may be, the common string is they asked questions. They asked relentless questions, and you have to have a certain brain space to be able to do that. One of the things I know you're probably about to wrap up, so I just want to throw something out there. I can speak forever, so please do shut me up. But I wanted to throw out there the idea that says, going back to this sort of amygdala idea, what happens is when we put particularly children in a state of fight or flight, that's what we're talking about. It's our reptilian amygdala, and it's getting that part of our brain ready to fight or to run or whatever, and we get pumped with adrenaline and cortisol, and stress builds, and we sort of do the full meerkat, and we're like, what's going on? And that's the thing with that, is that it's only meant to be in our system for a very short amount of time, and then it's gone. But if you keep children in a permanent state of fight or flight, we find they don't actually grow as much gray matter in their brains. They're less creative, and as a result, you're so much less likely to be rational or innovative or anything like that if you're constantly kept in a state of fight or flight. So that's at least my that's where I'm at in terms of trying to explain the biology behind gun control, and trying to make sure that, you know, kids aren't worrying about an active shooter. They're you know, focusing on the thing that they're meant to be doing, which is learning. So yeah, it's always been a stumbling block within our sort of circles to try and get this under control in America in particular.
And for a closing comment, I think this is the perfect closing comment. Everybody is dead, Dave. Holly.
Wonderful. Is that Holly from Red Dwarf?
I think so, because right above it, Mark Caesar says Red Dwarf reference.
I didn't even look at the chat. I just knew. Wonderful.
Okay, well, thank you so much for joining me, Dave, and to everyone in the chat and everyone watching later on. The links to purchase both of Dave's books are in the description, and Dave will be having another book come out, and either shortly before or after the third book comes out, I will have Dave on again to talk about that one as well. Thank you for coming, Dave. Any closing comments?
Thank you for having me. I think I've pretty much covered everything. The actual third book will not be around for a while.
Okay.
It could potentially be written relatively quickly. I mean, a lot of these, the first one was, the actual writing happened in a month, but the thinking for it happened over the course of 160 podcasts or whatever it was. So it's in a thinking stage at the minute. It's very conceptual. It's not solidified in any way. What will happen is I will end up writing something. I will get about 90% of the book done, and I'll come back to it later on, and I will hate it, and then I'll rewrite everything, and I'll send it off to people such as yourself, which is what I did in October, 6 months ago, and you will say everything's wrong, and I will go, yes, you're right, absolutely, I've messed up, and I rewrite it, and then it's better, and then it will be, I suspect initial thoughts would be sort of summer 2023, which would be great, because maybe throwing it out there, maybe an exclusive. I might end up speaking at various conferences about this, some place in the world somewhere that you may have heard of, so look out for that.
Okay, we will definitely have to do that. So with that, thank you everyone in the chat. Thank you, Dave. Happy Zombie Day, and live your life.
Hey. Bye, guys.